All right, I think we will get started. I want to welcome everyone. My name is Judy Margles. I'm the director at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. I welcome you to today's program, To Live is to Take Sides, focusing on the memoir of Lee Schore. Lee was an activist, writer, teacher, so much more, who died in Portland in August of 2020. I want to thank Linda Chaplik, Katie Riker for organizing today's event, the readers who will be introduced to you shortly, and to Lee Shore's daughters, Haley Schore and Marka Weinberg, who are also with us today. Our mission at the museum is to explore the legacy of the Jewish experience in Oregon, teach the universal lessons of the Holocaust, and provide opportunities for intercultural conversation. We challenge our visitors to resist indifference and discrimination and envision a just and inclusive world. And while we are able to offer this event, most other virtual events without charge, we're always grateful for any donation you're able to make to support our work. Our next months are full of programs. April is Genocide Awareness and Prevention Month. You're going to find information about programming, exhibitions, membership opportunities on our website. I'll mention one vital program taking place actually tomorrow, March 30th at 5 p.m., Resisting the Global Threat of Fascism and Conspiracy Theory, with Talia Lavin, who's the author of Culture Warlords, and Shane Burley, author of Why We Fight, Essays on Fascism, Resistance, and Surviving the Apocalypse. You're going to see a link in the chat if you want to register for this talk. I also want to let you know that one of our summer exhibitions is going to be works by Judy Chicago. These are works from the collection of Jordan Schnitzer and his family foundation. We're definitely planning to raise some good trouble with this exhibition. Lee Schore, as you're going to learn more, was born on December 25th, 1932. I just want to say one thing that really struck me in what I read of the memoirs. It's such an ironical date for her father to have a daughter born on that date. Her father, of course, was an Orthodox Jew. And as you're going to hear, the doctor suggested that she be named Christina in honor of the day, yet he chose to name her Liba, the Yiddish word for love. Today, our readers are going to give you a glimpse into Lee Shore's life as a mother, a friend, social worker, activist, teacher, union shop steward, ultimately a writer. I've been fortunate to read sections of the memoir. I know you're not going to be disappointed. If anything, for those of us devoted to the genre of memoir, you will delight in the beauty of Lee's writing and the experiences that she so deftly describes. I'm going to turn the program over to Linda Chaplik, who will introduce the readers. We really welcome your questions. I think you know the drill. Put your questions, please don't put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Linda, thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. And thank everyone for registering and for attending our program today. Lee was just a well-loved member of Portland's writing community, as Judy mentioned, and her life certainly encompassed a wide-ranging geography as well as multiple careers, but always she was an activist, she was a writer, and Lee always loved good food. And that food is going to manage to find its way into most of the selections that you'll be hearing this afternoon. Lee worked on her memoir titled To Live is to Take Sides, a storyteller's memoir, for over 20 years. She planned it as the story of her life, decade by decade. And I'm going to admit, I had a bias against memoir myself for a long time. I wondered, why would I be interested in the life of someone I didn't know? But very fortunately, I overcame that wrong-headedness. I've learned that when a memoir recounts common experiences, it also resonates in unexpected ways, no matter who the author is. The writer's words and events may be specific to her, but their, but their meaning can reach out to all of us in a universal way. Philip Lopate, in his introduction to the great anthology, The Art of the Personal Essay, tells us that at the core of the personal essay is the supposition that there's a certain unity to human experience. So in terms of Lee's work, your cherished food memories might not be lox and bagels, but surely you'll recognize the love behind her words and think about your own special connections. Our readers, as Judy mentioned today, were all members of Lee's community, her friends, her teachers, fellow writers, and we're so lucky to have Haley and Marka, Lee's daughters, with us today. We're opening with Sandy Polishuk, an oral historian, a writer, a textile artist, and an activist. And as you listen to her read, you'll understand why I hope no one here suffers from claustrophobia.
Well, I knew Lee before I met her because I often stared at her image. I volunteered at a progressive bookstore in the 70s where the view from the desk was a poster featuring Lee and her grand jury story, which you'll hear later. And then I met her in person in a women's group not long after she and Jerry moved to Portland. I'll be reading from a heavily edited for time chapter about a highlight of Lee's time in Poland, a bit over 20 years ago. Because she had pioneered a groundbreaking program for laid off workers, she spent a couple of years there as a consultant with a US Department of Labor project to work with coal miners whose mines were scheduled to close down. A few people are mentioned by name in it. There's Jim. He was another American consultant, but from the United Mine Workers of America. Darek, I hope I pronounced that right, a former coal miner, Polish coal miner, and now one of the Polish staff of the project. And then there's Jan, a Polish hero, one of the creators of the Solidarity Union 20 years earlier than this event, which freed Poland from the Soviet Union. He's also Darek's father and head of the Solidarity of the Mine. The piece is called Getting Down in Poland. The president of the mine caresses the map of the 80 miles of underground tunnels with his pointer. Now you're going to see the mine, the real mine, not the part we show tourists. You are going to the third level danger area. Is the lady coming with us? The president is somewhat bewildered by my going along. Women do not usually go into the mines. There are no women miners, no miners older than 55. Not only am I a woman, I'm 68. I'm going because it has always been my practice to know a workplace before I do a training or develop programs from the worker's point of view. I will be working with Polish coal mines and miners, and I need to learn as much as I can. If you have no objections, I respond almost too quickly. I am eager to go. Well then, take them to the showers. He waves his hand toward the mining engineer who will lead us down. For just a split second, I realized we are only a few miles from Auschwitz, and I wish he had used a different phrase, but I get up and smile bravely. I put on the denim pants and tie the rope around my waist, slip on the plaid flannel shirt, several sizes too big, button up the denim jacket and step into the hallway, feeling a little like Charlie Chaplin stepping onto the set. We enter shaft 2 and are directed into a steel mesh box that just fits the 8 of us and drops 2,400 feet in 2 minutes. The dropping box slows and slides to a stop. We are now in cold, dark dampness that substitutes for air. There are faint lights scattered down a tunnel to mark a pathway, but all else disappears into the darkest darkness I have ever known. We turn a few sharp corners and stop at the foot of a vertical steel ladder with narrow bars for rungs. This is the first moment of true doubt. The soles of the boots are slippery and they're too big for me. I start up one rung at a time, carefully placing one foot before lifting the other, and essentially pull myself up the damn thing. I see the top with relief and believe I can make it until I realize there are 3 more ladders waiting for me. Just then, I become aware of a strong hand pushing into the small of my back, balancing me. Without speaking a word, Jan and I ascend the ladder like this. We are now on solid straight ground, and I can finally look around, my eyes more accustomed to the darkness. Walking now through a long tunnel, 7 feet high and 12 feet wide, the air is good and walking is much easier. To compensate for this relative ease, the next tunnel is about 6 feet high, lined with steel mesh, and seems to be holding back a wall of large black coal boulders. Jim leans forward. Whatever you do, fall to the left if you lose your footing, and don't grab the conveyor belt on the right. That's how people die down here. We are now moving up a steady incline, stumbling over mud-covered rocks. The air is very thin. My breaths are almost gasps, though I fight to make them silent gasps. I'm really hot, flushed hot, dizzy hot. That strong hand is once again on my back, gently pushing me up the steepest incline. Derek comes over to say we are now halfway, but the next stretch, he tells us, is actually the most difficult. I begin to wonder, if you have a heart attack down here, do they carry you up or just bury you here in the coal dust? We move out of the small tunnel into a larger space where we can stand up, but the heat towards the top is overpowering. That's the gate of hell, gate to hell. Derek passes the information. The heat in there comes up from below and reaches well over 140 degrees. We edge away from the gate, grateful not to be heading through it. We arrive at a steel net box that whisks us up to shaft 1, several hundred feet deeper than our first drop down. Up we go, emerging unnoticed in the yard, just as another group of smudged-faced miners come up from their shift. Inside the administration building, we're guided to a table filled with steaming bowls of goulash, piles of crusty loaves of freshly baked bread, and many bottles of beer. There's no doubt this is the most exquisite glass of beer I have ever had. The cold, mellow gold liquid washes away the grit accumulated in my throat and sends a message to unlock my clenched muscles. The beer, the cigarette, the hot, steamy soup, the soft, crusty bread, the satisfaction of the return creates a sense of euphoria. The inevitable bottles of vodka appear, and we touch our glasses, faces glowing with relief. And I now understand that each trip out of the mind is a victory and a reason for celebration.
Thank you, Sandy. My heart races every time I hear that, no matter how many times I read or listen to it. When we thought about shaping today's reading, how we wanted to proceed, we thought we would start with that piece representing Lee in the career she made for herself after a lifetime of work, and then pose the question, well, where did this woman willing to go into a coal mine at age 68 come from? So Nancy LaPaglia, a longtime friend of Lee, who's taught art history at the city colleges of New York and at Chicago, and at PCC in Portland, is going to begin to answer that question with a piece called The Naming.
Okay. There's the lighter side of Lee you might not know. She had a fine sense of style about her clothes. She loved good food and parties. She laughed a lot. She was a good person to go out to dinner with. So here's the beginning, called The Naming. In the maternity ward, everyone is sleeping, some exhausted, others waiting. The young intern and 3 nurses gather in the staff lounge at midnight to welcome in Christmas. They share gifts and enjoy the champagne they have smuggled in. At 1:30, the celebration is interrupted by an urgent demand. Let me out of here. No one's ready but me. The birth is brief. They never get to the delivery room. The curly-headed intruder slips into the intern's hands just as the carolers move through the ward singing Joy to the World. The intern joins them, holding the baby above their voices as they wandered to the next ward. You came out smiling, my mother often tells me. The doctor went around declaring he had just delivered the new Christ child. It is December 25th, 1932. I am born a Democrat, the year Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected president, and one day after the banks close and the Depression arrives in Atlantic City. The total hospital bill for 7 days, the delivery and the doctor, is $32. My father, a humble man, a poor man, at least a foot shorter than the doctor, stands staring into the young intern's chest. He mutters in embarrassment, "I won't be able to pay the bill right away." "Don't worry," Dr. Kelly assures him. "This is my first Christmas baby, and what a present. She's my good luck omen for the year. Name her Christina and forget the bill." My father, a religious Orthodox Jew, takes my mother's engagement ring with its tiny diamond chip to the pawn shop. He presents the doctor with a handful of small bills and some change. "I'm grateful to your offer, and I'm grateful for my daughter, but I must name our child Liba, the Yiddish word for love." Liba becomes Libby by the time it's entered on the birth certificate. Libby becomes Libela when my mother yells out the second floor window, her voice carrying down the street. "Libela, come home now." This means leaving the delight of friends, and the name clearly does not belong on Texas Avenue, a street of Teresas and Tinas and Peggy's from the Italian and Irish Catholic families that fill the rest of the row houses. Libby almost became Elizabeth when the elementary school refused to accept it. "Libby's a nickname. What's your real name?" The vice president scowled over the rim of her glasses. "Must be Elizabeth," the secretary decided, and she made out papers for Elizabeth Schore. It was only after my furious mother produced the birth certificate that I could remain in school as Libby Schore. The kids on my block still taunted me with Libela, and I heard the chants of the 6th grade boys on my way home from school. "Libela, Libela, don't get near. We don't want Christ killers here." By 7th grade, I slowly merged into Libby Lee, trying to make Libela acceptable and American. That summer, a family from Baltimore rented our row house. My parents would move to the small, musty room in the basement, a seasonal hibernation for Atlantic City residents. My room would go to the young girl in the renter family, and I would go to camp. Summer camp was unimaginable on Texas Avenue, but my father knew the director and managed to get a partial scholarship. At Camp Tell High, everyone was from Philadelphia but me. Everyone was, quote, entitled to be there. I was part scholarship, part rented room. No longer the only Jew, but now the poor one. Still different, trying to fit in. That first day when we arrived at the Philadelphia train station where buses would take us to camp, the woman who brought me from Atlantic City pointed down the street. "The girls' camp is meeting around the corner. I'll meet you there. Your group is in bus 3. I stood paralyzed as I faced the entire boys' camp lined up on the narrowest sidewalk in the world. I was deathly afraid of boys, too shy to look at them. Getting to the girls' side was impossible. I would trip over my clumsy feet, pee in my pants, throw up, faint from terror. But what choice did I have? My room was rented. There was no going back. I clenched my fist, gritted my teeth into a frozen smile, and pretended I wasn't petrified. The older boys were at the end of the line. But after I survived the first half of that endless block, I was almost calm. Leaning against the wall, a cute, very cool 14-year-old near the end of the line asked, "What's your name?" "Lee," I said, staring straight into his eyes. And Lee she became, of course.
Thank you, Nancy. That was great. Our next reader is Andy Hockman, who is a writer, a teacher, and a storyteller living in Philadelphia, though she did used to live in Portland. Her reading, called Texas Avenue, is going to show us how activism began developing in Lee at a very tender young age.
Thank you. I knew Lee peripherally through the women's writing community in Portland, but I didn't get to know her well until I was living in Philadelphia and I led a memoir workshop for women in a very small fishing village on Mexico's Pacific coast, a village called La Barra de Potosí. I led that in 2008 and 2012. Lee was the only person to attend twice. And the place we were staying, bed and breakfast owned by an American expat, was hardly the Hilton. There were mice, there were mosquitoes, there were half walls open to the outdoors, bats flew through at night. And Lee was a complete trooper. Some of the pieces in the memoir, including the naming piece that you just heard, had their roots in Doña Laura's courtyard in La Barra de Potosí. This is called Texas Avenue. Texas Avenue was my world, bordered on the east by the famous Atlantic City boardwalk, beyond it the ocean, and beyond that, England. Cohen's produce market, Minter's butcher shop, the window filled with bare-fleshed animals hanging from lashed hooves. Petroli's was next to Minter's. Homemade Italian sausages, salamis, fresh pasta, piles of cheese in every shape, shelves filled with so many different spaghettis, pennes, orzo, and rigatoni that you could eat a different one every day for a month and not repeat. It was a street of immigrants from Italy, Ireland, and Poland. All of our houses held some part of the old country and some part of this new land, though no one seemed to have found the gold they all expected the streets to be lined with. Tina Benetto was my best friend. She lived 2 doors down the row of houses, and we were connected by one long porch that ran the whole block. The stoops to each porch were filled with kids playing cards or shooting marbles, and late in the warm, moist evenings, music would start on Tina's porch with her father, Tony Sr.'s accordion, her uncle's violin, and Tony Jr.'s new saxophone. The beach was our playground, the boardwalk our roller skating rink. It was a street where everyone lived together, celebrated together, knew each other. The connecting walls were not thick enough to shut out the music, the cries of pain, the laughter, and the violence from house to house. When I wasn't home, I was at the Benettos. Rosa, Tina's mother, was always cooking, tomatoes, basil, and garlic floating beneath the sweet smell of yeast bread rising and the licorice tasting hard cookies that always filled the cookie jar. On each table were the round white doilies that flowed from Tanta Maria's basket, the small bent-tip silver crochet needle fixed permanently in her hand. Tina's house was a happy place until Tony lost his job. At first, when he stopped going to work, it was even more fun. Tony Sr. let us help him in the little garden he made in the alley behind the house, where he grew basil and tomatoes and fennel for Rosa's sauces. We didn't have cookies as often, though, and Rosa's sauce no longer had those sweet homemade sausages floating in it. Tony Sr. cleared out a space in the basement and made a room for Tony Jr. so they could rent out his room. One day, we found a large piece of paper tacked onto the front door. It had big words on it that neither Tina nor I could read. I copied them down and asked my father what they meant. He said it meant a lot of trouble for Tony and Rosa. Tina and I were in the kitchen helping Rosa make the weak sauce when we heard a lot of noise. "Get off of my porch!" Tony Sr. faced 3 very large men, his hand curled into a fist. Without looking at Tina or me, Rosa said, "I want you both to go to Liba's house. Go through the alley, Liba. Tell your father to come quick." "Daddy, Daddy," I started yelling as soon as I got to the stairs. "Quick, before Tony gets hurt, something terrible is happening." We ran back to Rosa's house and saw Tony lying on the ground. My father was pointing at some papers, which he waved at the man who was wearing a suit and hat. The other 2 men, sleeves rolled up over their strained muscles, carried the green velvety sofa out of the house and dropped it next to the large wooden table that usually sat in the dining room. Tanta Maria still sat in her rocking chair, still holding the crochet needle and a white ball of yarn on her lap, but her chair was now on the sidewalk. A loud silence filled the street, a silence of rage. Tony was sitting on the stoop, holding a cloth to his cheek, which was bright red, turning blue. My father was talking to some of the neighbor men, shaking his head from side to side. Tanta Maria, in the middle of the circle, continued rocking, her fingers moving through her yarn. I ran to my father's side. Why didn't you stop them? How can this happen? It's not right, I screamed, blindly punching my fist at whoever was near. I pulled on my father's jacket. Make them put it back. He reached to lift me up, but I squirmed out of his arms, ran to the small tea table chair from Tina's room and started carrying it back up the porch. Come on, put it back. Put it all back where it belongs. We can't put it back, my father said, choking out the words in a whisper. It's the law. I don't care about those stupid laws. How can there be laws that aren't right? Does President Roosevelt know about this? I don't understand. I just don't understand. Shah, shah. He wiped my tears with the large white pressed handkerchief he always carried in his pocket. Look, I lifted my head from his shoulder and watched as one by one, small groups of men carried pieces of the Bonettos home to neighborhood houses where they would stay until the Bonettos were together again. Tina went to her cousins around the corner. Tony Jr. stayed with the Petrolies. Rosa moved in with her sister, and Tony Sr. left to work on a farm in Egg Harbor, about an hour away. Tanta Maria was carried to her neighbors across the street, where she sat in her chair at the window every day for all the days I lived on Texas Avenue.
Thank you, Andy. That was such a beautiful reading. Thank you so much. And next up, we have Sandra Dorr. Sandra is a writer and a writing teacher who lives in Grand Junction. She lived in Portland for a long time, which is how many of us got to know her. And she's going to tell you about the piece that she's going to read. Thanks.
Thanks, Linda. I got to know Lee, and I thought she was probably one of the most passionate and openly loving women that joined the different workshops that I taught. I taught at universities and at Haystack, but the private classes were really fun, and some of those women are here today, including Linda, and we got to know Lee very well. Lee wanted the classes at her house, so we held them, which was great fun, and she usually had food. And we also held a retreat on the coast at her home in Wheeler on the Sacred Feminine, which was a marvelous long weekend. And I miss her. I'm going to read a piece called Sabbath Dinner. I published it in a little book called At Susan's Table of Student Writings that I really treasure. Sabbath Dinner. This is just an excerpt from the piece. The only time my father's family got together was to eat. For us, Shabbos, the Jewish Sabbath, always started with a Friday night ritual meal at Bubby's apartment. Whoever came, the table was always loud. And when my younger uncles, Jack or Norman or Schnooks, were there, I could barely eat between the fits of laughter and my embarrassment at their relentless teasing. They were charming, good-looking, minor-type gangsters. One ran numbers for bookies, another was a fast-talking auctioneer, and one was a head waiter in the fancy mafia-run restaurant. I truly love them. They were my heroes, like Jewish versions of Clark Gable, Humphrey Bogart, and Alan Ladd. I had a secret crush on Jack and tried not to show my stomach-cramped jealousy of each beautiful shiksa he brought to the Friday night table. Bubby enjoyed every one of them and their strange blonde beauty. But when Zadie, my grandfather, was alive, Jack wouldn't have dared to come with a Gentile. For my grandfather, the streets of America felt no safer than the ghetto in Russia, and Gentile meant pogrom and death. He pored over reports of concentration camps and waited for news of his family in the shtetls, the ghettos of Lithuania, where he had been taken as a teenager to apprentice with the Tsar's furrier. But after Zadie died, Jack had moved Bubby into this 2-bedroom apartment with him, though he was really never there, Only his clothes stayed between washings. She loved it, called it her palace. The meal always started with the best part first, Bubby's homemade gefilte fish. Sometimes I even got to help her make the beloved delicacy. The cast iron smusher was attached to the rim of the kitchen table, a large bolt holding the vise tightly. A light blue enamel bowl was placed below the round spout with its many shaped grids that determined the size of the fish strands it would spit out. Peering down into the cylinder, I turned the handle and watched the spiral masher twirl in pirouettes. I waited for Bubby to push the cut up pieces of fish down into the throat of the machine with her fingers until a slurping sound meant I would turn the handle with great effort, forcing the slippery pieces down into the spiral cutting blades. As Bubby pushed down with a flat bottom wooden prod, the fish twisted into a mashed mess, the machine burping and belching until it finally extruded long greenish gray tubes of an unidentifiable slimy pulp into the bowl. But when the scoop was mixed with eggs, breadcrumbs, grated onions, chopped carrots, and some mysterious seasoning, and patted into small oval loaves, baked in the oven, and finally served with the fresh grated horseradish that burned through the genetically stuffed sinuses and made us all laugh at the red faces around the table, sputtering and coughing, my father would declare it a mihaya, the weekly pleasure of life as it welcomes the Sabbath. Next came bowls of floating gold, chicken soup, the sacred nectar of Jewish motherhood that had cooked all day, fusing separate vegetables into a broth smooth as silk. The soup was followed by the plate of dill-flavored boiled chicken, carrots, and parsnips that were lifted out of the soup pot and served with the challah, the Sabbath egg bread. And if we were not stuffed enough, the dinner ended with Bubby Schore's indescribable flaky apple strudel. Are you hungry yet? The Friday night dinners at Bubby's ended when she died. Now I make chicken soup, but not on Fridays, usually just when someone has a cold. I never have made gefilte fish again, but once a year I buy it in the store. Last year, though, I did plant fresh horseradish. Last month, I found a cast iron grinding mill in a thrift store and attached it to the counter in the pantry. After I tightened the clamp, I turned the handle once or twice and listened for the echo of a slurp or Bubby's laughter.
Thanks, Sandra. I do wonder where that smusher has gone to. Marka and Haley, maybe one of you has it. That is great. So moving on, and I should say, by the way, we were going to have Ruth Gundel with us today, who was going to read the piece that Marka and Haley will read, but she was unable to join us. So we're so delighted to have Lee's daughters reading this piece about Yom Kippur. And before they start, just a reminder that if anyone has any questions, to please use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat, but type in any questions and we will be sure to get them addressed. So Marka and Haley, they're going to alternate reading this piece about Yom Kippur. So thank you so much, both of you.
Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. In Atlantic City, when I was a young girl, Yom Kippur was the most solemn day of the year for Jews, the Day of Atonement, the day your name is sealed either on the Book of Life or the Book of Death, was the one day everyone we knew went to the Rodef Shalom synagogue to pray, even though most of them had not set foot inside the musty hall all year.
It was the High Holy Days, the start of the new year for Jews. I sat in the balcony with my mother and her mother, my Bubby, and all the other women in this Orthodox Schore, separated from the men. I resented having to sit like second-class citizens up in that balcony. But there was also a special strangeness to it, an old worldliness.
Sometimes with my eyes squinted tight, almost shut, I could make this old synagogue fade into ancient days when another young girl, just like me, surrounded by women, peered down at the dark rows of worn wooden benches lined with white yarmulkes on the heads below and the weave of prayer shawls draped over the swaying shoulders of men. I thrilled at the sound of the shofar, the blowing of the ram's horn, a piercing sound I knew was the voice of God.
And if I squinted hard enough, the voices around me became Jewish women everywhere, anywhere, anytime. Their long hair pulled into tight buns, babushkas tied under their chins. But the faces were the same. These women stretched through the ages, swaying in the same rhythm, murmuring the same words, shushing their children, smiling down at their husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons. In those moments, I felt safe and eternal.
When I was 13, I left the synagogue on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and walked across the street to the diner and had a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich, my first non-kosher meal. It would have been bad enough to simply eat on this day of fasting, but to break the kosher laws and eat pork was a sin. I bit into the crunch of the brittle bacon and waited for lightning to strike me down. I ignored the stares from the men gathered in front of the synagogue and walked the 1 block to the ocean to cry my rage into the waves.
That year, I could no longer squint through the ages. I could only hear the harsh din of gossip around me. My mother, my grandmother, and I sat in our worn cloth coats, conspicuous among the black, shiny, tight curls of Persian lamb, the pillow soft fluff of sheared beaver, the fox stoles complete with shiny glass eyes and tiny paws hanging lifeless over tailored suits. Arrogantly worn, although the temperature that day was above 90 degrees. I reached for my mother's hand, feeling the anger behind the red blush of shame that colored her face as she caught the whispers, filled with mock pity, that the Schores just didn't know how to be successful. I wondered then if success was only measured by how many dead animals you wore.
My tiny, frail bubby had walked the 5 miles to the services from her apartment because you were not supposed to ride on this day. While the rest of us were symbolically tapping our chests as we recited the prayers of forgiveness, I watched her fist beat down upon her bird-like chest to drive out each of her sins. God, forgive me, I lied. God, forgive me, I coveted my neighbor's home. God, forgive me, I spoke harshly to my children. God, forgive me, God, forgive me. I hovered near her, terrified she would collapse from the harshness of her prayers. I looked at the fear on my bubby's face as she faced God's judgment of her life. I looked into the faces around us that held no reverence, no fear. I saw no desire for atonement for all the sins they had committed and were committing right there, whispering their judgments of others.
Then came the moment of rest in the service. The cantor, who led the chants in his plaintive voice that cried with the pain of centuries, sat quietly. The rabbi, in his high-crowned white satin Yom Kippur hat, whose voice thundered up to the balcony and who always filled me with the fear of being truly seen by him, finished reading the passage for this day, closed the Torah, and sat down. The officers of the congregation were given the honor of announcing the amount of money given by each member to the synagogue that year. They read out the names in order of contribution, from most to least. I watched the swollen pride of those who had given the most money looking around.
I could barely watch my father as his name was finally called near the end of the list when those who gave smaller amounts were mentioned. I couldn't bear to see him shrinking into his seat, not looking around at anyone, feeling less worthy in their eyes. My father never made a lot of money. He managed some apartment buildings and was considered a saint by the tenants, mostly Italian immigrants, as he had been a Jewish immigrant. He often paid the rent for those who had just lost their jobs, knowing they just needed a little time to get on their feet again. He was eventually always repaid, and always it was accompanied by the large pots of homemade spaghetti from the Italian wives. I tried squinting through the ages, but all I felt was an internal rage at the pretenders who were being rewarded for all the wrong reasons. I left the synagogue that day and never returned to Rodef Shalom.
It is 50 years since that day. It is Yom Kippur. I sit next to my mother, who no longer knows who I am, holding her paper-thin hand as she dozes in her wheelchair. We are at a humble service in front of a small makeshift holiday altar with one Torah scroll and no eternal light in the nursing home where she now lives. I wish she knew where she was. She would love the new furniture and matching drapes. For once in my life, she always said, I want to have new furniture that matches so I can hold my head up. So finally, for once in her life, here it is. She never did get the Persian lamb coat that she longed for, but in this room, filled with dozing bodies in wheelchairs, no one cares. Like my mother, they all live somewhere else in their memory. I chant the prayer of forgiveness, my clenched fist hitting my chest to drive out my sins. I squint through the years to smile at my father and my bubby, listen for the echo of the aching voice of the chauffeur, and wonder in which book our names will be written this year.
Thank you both. That can't have been too easy to read, but it was really a treasure to hear you both. And I love the sharing of it. That was a terrific idea. So thank you both. And our last reader today is Katie Ryder, a Portland writer with her own history of activism. Katie has very fond memories of searching with Lee for the very best dumplings that Portland could offer. So Katie, tell us a little bit about what you are going to read.
Okay. Well, first I met Lee briefly in Oakland in the early 1980s, but became close to her in the 90s after she and Jerry moved back up here to Portland. And she was in many ways a mentor. Lee could be a bit scary and opinionated at times, but always she was a loving and trusted friend. I miss her humor and her affection more than I can say. So first, a little background for the piece I'm about to read. In the mid-60s, Lee, recently divorced in her 30s, lived with her daughters, Marka and Haley, in Venice in a beautiful old house she could not afford on her own. She worked at UCLA as a counselor with a group of students who had received a grant from the Ford Foundation to initiate an experimental education program. And little by little, those students moved into the house and it became a collective. Living with them at the time were Lee's cousin and her boyfriend, who turned out to be an FBI informant. One day in the late 60s, Lee was greeted by a nice young man who delivered a subpoena, ordering her to a grand jury in Tucson. Eventually, it seemed to have something to do with the cousin's boyfriend, who had driven a car registered to Lee's address to Arizona. The questioning went on for days about the cousin's boyfriend's car and about the young people living in the house. Lee said, it was very evident in the questioning that they knew a lot about me, a lot more than I ever knew. They asked if I had ever visited a specific address on a particular date. I was startled when I realized that the pages and pages sitting on the small table were reports on everything I had done for 2 years. Eventually, 4 other people in the house were subpoenaed. Now they were asking about people I lived with, people I worked with, the kinds of questions you just can't answer. The group agreed not to testify. After a hearing, Lee was granted immunity, and that meant if she didn't testify, she would be jailed for contempt. Lee tells us, I heard the words, but I found it too surrealistic to comprehend. Although I had considered the possibility of going to jail, I never really believed it. I was a good person, a respectable person. I had committed no crime. I would not be sent to jail. I was in a state of shock, disbelief, as they shackled my hands to my waist and my waist to my ankles. This is not real. It's a bad movie. She was jailed for months, then released pending appeal and went home for 2 weeks. The appeal was denied. Their lawyer arranged for the 3 who were left, Lee and her roommates, Karen and Pam, to report back to jail at 6 the following morning. A farewell dinner was planned with Lee's mother to cook her wonderful cabbage borscht. And here we begin the final night. I didn't want a house full of people that night. I just wanted to lie on the couch with my girls wrapped in my arms, 2 brave and bewildered children, afraid to love again, all of us afraid to cry again. Still, I supposed a large collective dinner would keep us from having to face it for a while longer. Right after dinner, the girls and I could snuggle. When I got to the house, my mother was in the kitchen, the smell of the sweet and sour cabbage cooking in deep, rich broth already filling the house with a memory of old Polish peasants. Haley and Pat were setting the table. Marka was helping Nana find things in the kitchen. Wayne and John and Dennis were huddling upstairs, undoubtedly getting high. And Pam and Karen had just returned from a last visit to the ocean. We were gathering to eat our last meal. Our revolutionary spirit thinly masked the fears and the coming loss of the sun, the ocean, color, music, each other. The knock was harsh, startling, and unmistakably unfriendly. They just walked in, 6 of them, through the unlocked front door. Lee Weinberg, Pam Donaldson, and Karen Duncan step out here, arms forward, wrists touching. The demanding voice of the federal marshals sucked all the air out of the room. We were frozen in the moment, barely breathing, caught in a snapshot of fear. John approached them first, insisting we had agreed to report to the federal building the next morning at 6. Dennis went to call Barry. Don't bother to call your lawyer. Our orders are to take you in now. Karen protested that she was in a wet bathing suit and needed to change. No, you can't change. You, looking at Pat, get a coat for her. Larry here will go with you to make sure you don't get anything else. No, you can't get other shoes and you won't need a purse. The weight of the metal on my wrists and the sounds of the cuffs locking us to each other rapidly moved me out of the confusion of the moment into the reality of being a prisoner again. I hadn't even hugged my kids yet. When I tried to move forward toward them, I was jerked back and pushed toward the door. I tried to speak with my eyes, to tell them it was okay, to burn my love into their memory. Haley, only 8, confused and ashamed of whatever imagined terrible thing her mother had done, stared at the floor, clinging to Pat's leg. Marka, prepared not to feel anything, stood alone, staring at the handcuffs. Then my mother, all 4 feet 10 inches of her, came flying out of the kitchen, wooden spoon held high, as the 3 of us were pulled toward the door, surrounded by the 6 federal marshals. What's going on here? Nana, wanting no details, had let herself believe we were just going on a trip. No, they can't go anywhere. They haven't eaten dinner yet. Unwilling to be ignored, she tugged at the sleeve of one of the marshals. Sit. There's plenty of borscht for all of you. Wayne, get some more chairs. See, there's plenty of room. The marshal shrugged her off his arm, prodding us out the door. She followed, waving the wooden spoon, her pleading turning into a familiar screech. In one last desperate move, she jumped on the back of a marshal and began hitting him on the head with the spoon, all 4 foot 10 of her geared for battle. Now it is important to understand that not eating is a serious offense to a Jewish mother, but the thought of wasted food is an absolute sin. By the time they pushed us into the car, we were all laughing so hard, it was easy to cry. The car drove off with Nana running behind, spoon waving in the air, her voice trailing after us. Bring them back, they haven't eaten yet. Oy vey, what will I do with so much borscht? I looked out through the back window of the car and saw her figure grow smaller and smaller behind us until she disappeared in the distance. Then fast forward to Lee's 50s and 60s, she founded the Center for Working Life in Oakland and then moved to Portland. The center worked with laid off workers, designing programs, training them to be peer counselors in the midst of the trauma of losing their livelihoods. She traveled to Alaska, Poland, and Bulgaria, which is how she came to be in the coal mine. And that's it.
Thank you, Katie. Honestly, no one makes me laugh and cry as much as Lee in the space of one short piece. So one more reminder that if you have questions, there's some already, type them into the Q&A and we'll do our best to get them answered.
Great. And I see some questions coming in and I've got a few of my own. First of all, I just want to agree with you, Linda, you're laughing and crying at the same time. And there's just something infused with love through all this writing and very poignant. So thank you to all of you for your beautiful readings, and Marka and Haley, it's really just an honor that you read too. I know one question that is on everyone's mind is, will the memoir be published? What are the plans for the memoir?
And Haley, can you address that?
I actually think the best person to answer that would be Jerry, but I know he's still in a deep state of mourning, and things like this are sometimes too challenging. So I think though that, I don't know if one option is to gather names of people who are interested in the memoir. I don't know if he's just going to send it out or if he is going to self-publish it, or, I don't know what the plans are, but I know that he would love to hear the interest.
That's great. And I know there's a group in Portland who've been wanting to help get it in shape. So a lot of people would like to be able to get their hands on it.
Yeah, I think everyone listening in today is going to be very interested in that. Another question, and you're all writers. So what is it in particular, and I'm sort of throw it out to all of you, Linda, you can sort of figure out who should answer, but what is it about Lee's writing that has drawn you into it? Like, what is it about her writing that speaks to you so deeply?
And I bet all of us would have our own answer to that. And maybe we can just quickly say, what I love about Lee's writing, well, first of all, is the food, because I'm very interested in food. And she just makes me hungry. Mm-hmm. And her descriptions are so very remarkable. And that was one of the first, and her personality was so warm that it just, as she wrote and as she read, you were there with her. You were always right there with her. She had an immediacy about it. And some of my memories are shared memories, some things she wrote about I knew nothing about, but it was always, her voice was so very specific.
Anybody else wanna?
Well, for me, the thing that the writings have, where they show Lee as the sometimes completely uncompromising person she could be, and at the same time, so funny and so loving. And she somehow carried all those qualities, and it's what made her, her special, unique Lee-ness.
Anybody else? Or I can, lots of other questions. Perhaps we can move on. Another writer.
Judy, Sandra was going to say something.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Sandra.
I grew up in a working class household and felt that kind of same sting that she felt. And we were a very large Catholic family in a big Scandinavian neighborhood in Minnesota, and we just stuck out. And what I loved working with Lee and listening to her is that she, like that description that I read of the gefilte fish, we worked so hard on that to get it exactly to what it was that it was discussing, and it was wonderful, and it was love, and it was food. And like you said, Linda, about laughing and crying at the same time, we had such passion, and she worked so hard. There's something I think that Annie was reading where we had the paper thin hand of the grandmother. So it's a lot of work to get writing done like that. And Lee was not afraid of work. She just jumped in, and that passion was so beautiful to witness and to hear today. Everybody read so beautifully. Thank you.
Someone is asking just to, if one of you can talk about her time on the Oregon coast.
I was living down at the Oregon coast for when she was, so that's why I'm speaking up. She got very involved down there, of course. I remember there was some kind of cooperative coffee shop they started in Wheeler, and she was just really good about getting people organized. There was some kind of, I know there are people on the coast here, but they're not they're not panelists who can speak. But if you want to put things in the chat, coast people, I saw your names there. There was something about local money. I mean, there was all kinds of radical stuff going on, and it was coming from Lee and Jerry, a lot of it. And they're the people down at the coast are very progressive. They're good friends. The other people involved are very progressive too. So they were willing participants, but I really do believe that it was Lee and Jerry who were big instigators. And the other thing was I hung out at their house a lot, had a fabulous view. Oh my God. And they did a wonderful remodel. They had this huge table, which they had at their big house near Reed too. I think the same table. And you could get a lot of people around it. There were so many dinners there, so much, I don't know, just so much generosity. And often other people who needed a place to live would be there, would be living with them. And I see that Lorraine just put something in the chat about the money that I was not qualified to speak about. So do check out the chat.
I will say that my biggest memory of her on the coast was the smoked fish lady. And is she still there? I don't know, but no.
No,
That was
Carla's long gone, sorry.
She's gone. Yeah.
I think that's the thing that kept my mom there the longest, was that smoked fish lady who made the most incredible smoked fish of all time. But she also befriended the youth, the young people that sort of all grew up together there. And she really kind of became a mentor for all of them. And I think they called her, Marka, do you remember what they called her? The, I don't know, like the sage lady or something.
I love it. And maybe a question for Marka and Haley or for anybody, but so much of her memoir, her Jewishness is infused, her ambivalence, her rebellion, her love, so infused throughout the memoir. Can you reflect on how her Jewishness informed her activism? I mean, it started right there on Yom Kippur when she was 13 eating that bacon sandwich, but more generally, her activism.
So I can go first, and Haley, you can pipe up. I think the Yom Kippur story is, I mean, that's just her to the core, and that encapsulates the relationship, both in terms of the support, the connection through generations, but also the strong sense of justness and injustice and a desire to fight it. I think a couple other thoughts I have on that are, although our grandparents were Orthodox, as she said in the story, she never really did go back to temple, and we were not raised with the religion as much as we were raised with the culture. And Passover was her favorite holiday. It's my favorite holiday. And for her, it was the story of a successful uprising of the proletariat. And it was, so she tied it all together. But I think it was Elijah, and the sense that as long as one person's hungry, we're all hungry, and it's up to us to feed everybody. And so I think that she was raised with that from day one, and so I think it informed everything. And then the other part was the Holocaust. I mean, she definitely grew up. I think that's in one of the stories that we didn't read today, but she grew up with this very stark awareness of persecution and how being Jewish could make you stand out and could make you a victim. And so I think that all got rolled in as well.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah, my feeling was that that after that experience of the synagogue that we read, where she rejected it because of the sexism and the classism and the shaming, and knowing what a good person her father was, and the fact that he had to be so humiliated in that moment for giving away his money to people who really needed it. I think that there was a rejection, but then what I noticed was that the older she got, the more Jewish she became. And she kind of like embraced it again, because I think suddenly she understood that it was compatible with her politics and the fight for justice. So I really think it was in her later years that, like, I was like, oh my God, she has become like a committed Jew. So that was interesting, that journey.
Oh, thank you. You know, we're having such a good time. I'm just looking at the clock, and it is after the 1 o'clock hour. We're going to keep going just a few more minutes because there are some additional questions. I know some people might have to log off and get back to their days. So, but we will keep going a few minutes longer. Thank you. Anybody else want to reflect on her Jewishness and how yes, Nancy, I see a hand raised.
The piece that I read about the naming that ends with her telling that cute, cool boy that her name was Lee, had a couple of paragraphs that came after it that I didn't have time to put in. And it does tell how she, in some ways, came back to Liba by the end, and that so that the naming was actually from Liba to Liba with a lot of other things in between.
Fascinating. I'd love to talk a little bit about memoir. And I don't know, you know, the writers and all of you who are writers, whether you want to reflect a little bit about why she may have chosen to write in the memoir genre as opposed to autobiography, and whether that was discussions you had in your writing groups, or just, you know, say something about memoir and autobiography, if you would.
Honest. She was one of the most honest people. I just don't think it wasn't that she couldn't lie, she just wasn't interested in it. And so I think, you know, in writing, probably somewhat everyone here would say you write what comes and what sings and what works. And so for Lee, those stories just poured out. And then she worked and reworked and got them to bounce and sing on the page. But I think it was their honesty. That's what I would think.
We had a little discussion yesterday about the difference between memoir and autobiography. And I'm curious, not to put anyone on the spot, Sandra or Andy, but I do wonder if you can encapsulate what the difference really is between those two.
Sure. I'm happy to talk about that a little bit. So typically an autobiography is what we might think of as a more traditionally told life story, beginning at the beginning, moving in a linear fashion from, birth to the present moment, trying to be comprehensive in its scope. And when you write memoir, I think the emphasis is more on stories, not necessarily told in linear fashion. Maybe it can be constructed in a more associative way. I mean, a memoir can be organized in lots of different ways, but I think the focus is more on voice and storytelling, and putting pieces of one's life in conversation with one another, so that as an aggregate, it leads up to some kind of understanding. With a memoir, I also think often the writer's own voice is more present on the page. We hear the writer asking questions about her own life. What does this mean? Why is this important? Why has this stuck with me? What's not typically part of this story? How would it have been different from another person's point of view? Almost a little window into the writer's thinking, what does this all mean? And why have I invited the reader here? So I think those are some of the important differences. And Lee was a storyteller, whether she was doing that out loud or on the page. And so I think memoir was really a perfect form for her.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd just like to say express one word of, or a number of words of gratitude towards Jerry Atkin, because he, my mom came obviously to live out loud. And like you said, she was a storyteller. And in the end, she lost her ability to speak. And Jerry became her voice. And he did a truly heartfelt and really thoughtful, I think, and beautiful job of sort of piecing this memoir together and sort of adding the connective tissue between stories. And, I'm sorry he couldn't be here today, but I know how grateful he is for all of you. And I'm just grateful to him.
Thank you. Thanks.
Beautiful. Any last comments from anybody? I think there is one question that I suspect many of us are curious about, and Mark and Kelly, you might be the ones to answer this. What happened after the marshals took your mother away?
Well, Marco was older, so.
You got to eat, right?
Yes, we did get to eat. And that was the third or fourth time that they were out on appeal and then went back to jail. This was the one that they were going to turn themselves in, and they had done that before, and they came to the house that time, and so it was quite a shock. But in terms of, I think that was the worst experience for her and the rest of, they call themselves the Tucson Five, the rest of them, because they were in LA County Jail for a night or two before they got transferred back to Arizona. But I'm not sure if the question was about that particular night, but the arc of the story, and Haley's working on a screenplay about it, so she can embellish. But they were called before a grand jury that really was doing witch hunting, and they had to repeatedly take the fifth. They couldn't answer any questions, or you'd have to answer all of them, work with the lawyers. And it was over the course of 6 months, I think, Cal, is that right? That they were in and out. And then as grand juries go, because they had nothing, because it was a witch hunt, there were actually no real charges, that they, when the grand jury expired, then they were released. So they were never charged with anything.
Yeah.
And then that's when our lives got back a little bit to normal. That's when we moved to Portland.
Wonderful. Linda, any last reflections from you or?
No, other than it's just so great to hear her stories in other voices as well. I mean, it's still Lee, but it's such a treat to hear different people reading her words. So this has been really wonderful.
Yeah,
thank you, Judy, so much.
Our pleasure. And I also want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to all of you. It was really just a pleasure to just have this moment where we were able to cut out all the noise of the world and just really focus on some wonderful storytelling. And Marka and Haley, just to reiterate how beautiful it was to have you both here today. Even for those of us who didn't know her at all or really weren't, not familiar with the writing, it was a little teary too. So thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you, those of you listening in. The program is recorded. I do want to extend thanks to Amber Kirsten, who's in the background. She's that little square on the screen for taking such good care of all of us to make sure the tech part of the program is going well. As I mentioned, the program is recorded, should be up on our website, if not by the end of the day, by tomorrow. So thank you so much for joining us. I do look forward to seeing you again. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.